These are just a few of my favorite bits that I've decided to put together, kind of like a thumbnail sketch overview of Senate Hearing 104-593 from July 17th, 1996. All right, so let's go ahead and get into this statement of the Honorable John M. Deutsch, Director of Central Intelligence. Director Deutsch speaking his statement. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appear this morning at your request to explain the policy of the Central Intelligence Agency concerning the possible use of American journalists, American clergy, or Peace Corps members. As you know, Mr. Chairman, I am uneasy discussing potential intelligence sources in a public session, but I am in a position to make some general statements in this very sensitive issue. Very sensitive issue. Yeah, sidebar there. Anyway, moving right along with this statement. Simply put, the Central Intelligence Agency policy is not to use organizations, American clergy. I'm sorry. Let me start that again. Simply put, the Central Intelligence Agency policy is not to use journalists accredited to American news organizations, their parent organizations, American clergy, or the Peace Corps for intelligence purposes. This includes any use of such organizations for cover. The policy that I just stated, Mr. Chairman, has been in place for some 20 years. Recently, 19 more years more precisely. Interjection here. Given that this happened in 1996, 19 years prior, let's see, that would have been 1977, right? Yeah, that would have been 1977. Colonia Dignidad. This nifty little site over here, connection to William Branham. Anyway, that's something we can dive into more at another time. I've got a video I'll tag on to the end of all this to help explain it real quick. Anyway, recently, 19 years more precisely, recently at the request of this committee, I received the policy to determine whether it was both appropriate and sufficiently circumscribed. As I told you, Mr. Chairman, and this committee, when this issue was raised with me, my sympathy is on the side of the no intelligence use of American journalists or clergy. I strongly believe in the independence of our free press and the division between government and the church. Yeah, and that is why I have stated publicly that I have no intention of using either American journalists or clergy for intelligence purposes. Interesting. Paul Kane. Anyway, moving along. Further, as this committee knows, I have no circumstances, or I found no circumstances while I am Director of Central Intelligence that have caused me to do either. But, Mr. Chairman, as the Director of Central Intelligence, I must be in a position to assure the President and the members of the National Security Council and this country that there will never come a time when the United States cannot ask a witting citizen, knowledgeable citizen, to assist in combating an extreme threat to the nation. So I, like all my predecessors for the last 19 years, have arrived at the conclusion that the agency should not be prohibited from considering the use of American journalists or clergy in exceptional circumstances. I wonder what he considers exceptional circumstances. It's an interesting turn of phrase. He goes on to say, I am able to imagine circumstances, Mr. Chairman, in which the lives of American hostages depend upon particular knowledge only a journalist might have or obtain. I can foresee the possibility of a terrorist group attempting to use a weapon of mass destruction in a crowded urban area where both the president and the nation would look to the agency to use all possible measures, all possible means to detect and deter such an event. Um, how did that work out for the Boston Marathon bombing? How did that work out for 9/11, which was what, 5 years after this, give or take? Oh boy. Anyway, back to his statement. Under either of these scenarios, I believe it is reasonable to foreclose the Central Intelligence Agency asking. Okay, let me try that again. Under either of these scenarios, I believe it is unreasonable to foreclose the Central Intelligence Agency asking an American citizen with their knowledge to help be a source of information. Huh. Narky narc narc? Anyway. Now, critics of this discussion might well say that these are far-fetched examples in which the possible confluence of highly improbably circumstances. Hang on, what? Now, critics of this decision might well say that these are far-fetched examples in which the possible confluence of highly improbably circumstances is fanciful when weighed against the possible suspicion that it puts clergy and journalists, Peace Corps volunteers who are abroad at risk. Unfortunately, recent history has shown that the threat in these scenarios is very real. I do not believe that as director of the Central Intelligence that I can gamble that that future sources of critical information will come only from predictable sources. Nothing in my 14 months in this job supports that kind of judgment. Having decided that I should allow the possibility of exceptional waivers, I looked carefully at your request, at the guidelines which govern such waivers. I found them restrictive but non-specific. I have, therefore, issued new policy guidelines which set out several specific tests that must be satisfied before the director or deputy director may consider a waiver. These guidelines have been available to both both intelligence committees. They are clarified, and I am available to discuss them in any detail the committee may wish in closed session, always behind closed doors. But I want to state, he goes on to say, that the guidelines require prompt as well as periodic notification of the Intelligence Committee in those extraordinary circumstances when an exception to the policy might be granted. Let me repeat. These guidelines allow for the possibility of a waiver, but they do not compel or encourage such waivers. I have not changed my view that it would take extremely rare, indeed highly improbable circumstances to change my predilection against any waiver of our policy not to use journalists, not to use clergy for intelligence purposes. There is one other aspect of this question that deserves comment in this public session, which is who ought to be the official entrusted with the responsibility to decide whether to waive this policy. I considered whether the president ought to be the decision maker. In the end, we decided such decisions should remain with the director. The director is the official entrusted with running intelligence operations. The director ought to be responsible for this operational, albeit extremely important decision in those rare situations where it might be contemplated. If the director fails to give the direct proper attention or judgment, the director can be overruled or fired by his boss, the president. Let me return for a moment to the Peace Corps. Here too, our policy is not to use Peace Corps personnel for intelligence purposes. This has not changed, and here any waiver could occur under even more circumscribed circumstances. Last, I would like to close by commenting on the Richardson Amendment adopted by the House. The Richardson Amendment requires that the President decide any waiver on the intelligence use of an American journalist. I have said, as I believe, this gives the President greater flexibility to overrule judgments if this decision rests with the director. The Richardson Amendment also excludes cases of voluntary cooperation between the agency and a particular journalist. Like Tucker Carlson, maybe? Just a side thought there. This is important because we would never contemplate a relationship without the witting and willing cooperation of the individual involved. Mr. Chairman, this completes my statement, and I am happy to answer any questions you may have that are appropriate in a public hearing, and of course, I will be pleased to provide any additional details you may wish in a closed session. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Statement of Ted Koppel, Anchor, Nightline, ABC News. Mr. Koppel says, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thank you for inviting me here this morning, and for this opportunity to make a few preliminary comments. As you no doubt expected, I am unalterably and categorically opposed to the notion of the CIA having the legal option of using journalism as a cover for its officers or agents. Having said that, there are circumstances under which the agency has, under what it perceives to be the greater national interest, broken American laws in the past, and I have no doubt that it will continue under such circumstances to do so in the future. Pragmatism demands that we accept that as a fact of life in the gathering of intelligence. It does not require, however, that Congress sanctions such illegal behavior with its own benediction, or that it facilitate the process by changing our laws. Let me begin by giving you the perspective of someone who has been a working journalist for more than 35 years. As things already stand, most governments, police, and intelligence agencies around the world assume that many, if not most, American journalists working overseas are, at the very least, sharing information with the CIA and probably working for the agency. Since that is the way most of them operate, it is only natural that they assume we do so also. Until now, we have been at least able to point to American law to insist that we would be breaking the law if we work simultaneously as journalists and intelligence operatives. It wasn't much, but it was all we had. Occasionally, we were even able to convince people in other countries that Americans are curiously attached to their laws, even when those seem to complicate the process of governing. It will be much easier for those foreign government and agencies if we would give them yet another opportunity to assume that the United States is, after all, just like them. It will certainly make life so much more difficult for my colleagues and me. It will also place an even greater strain on the worn thread of credibility that exists between American journalists and our readers and viewers if they are left to wonder which of us is still trying to maintain some ethical and professional standards and who among us are actually working for U.S. intelligence. Those of my colleagues who have devoted a lifetime to striving for fairness and objectivity in their work, who have genuinely reported without fear or favor, will now have to settle for the assumption that they were just maintaining their cover. How often the CIA would actually use such cover is beside the point. The relevant question is how often it would be assumed, both home and abroad, that American reporters are working with a second secret agenda. Which brings me back to my initial point. The gathering of intelligence is a difficult, dangerous, and sometimes dirty operation. That is not my judgment. That is what we have repeatedly been told by senior intelligence officers. It is they, including the distinguished current director of Central Intelligence, who explain the use of tainted assets by invoking the need to deal with crooks and thugs in the interest of protecting our national security. Oh, thought interjection there. Operation Underworld. What was that, 1942 to 1945? I'll have to come back to that another time. Anyway, getting back to Mr. Koppel's statement. Closing it out, it looks like. When, as they sometimes do, U.S. intelligence officers circumvent or even break American laws, they must reckon with the possibility that they will one day be held to account. If their arguments are persuasive, if it is true that the national interest could not be served in any other fashion, the Congress can be expected to be lenient and understanding. But at least everyone understands that a line has been crossed and that there may be consequences. If the CIA must on occasion use the role of an American journalist to conceal one of its operatives and to protect the greater national interest, it will do so, regardless of what is decided by Congress. But let that continue to be in the knowledge that a free press being endangered and that American law is being broken. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Argue chimes in. I would quote from a letter from Senator Hatfield sent to Director Deutsch, where he makes the statement that I would say in response to your question. The suspicion created by CIA involvement with even one overseas member of U.S.-based religious organizations puts the welfare of all in jeopardy. Therefore, allowing a waiver of this policy is tantamount to declaring no policy at all. Senator Robb, your positions are clear. You can understand the dilemma that we might face in terms of how broad an application of such a waiver or exemption might be. But thank you for your testimony. Mr. Chairman, I thank you. Chairman Specter, Thank you very much, Senator Rob. Thank you very much, Sister Claudette, Dr. Argue, Dr. Orm, Dr. Page. For those who expressed some concern about the public hearings in this matter, the testimony today, for any of those who might be watching around the world who might suspect journalists or church workers or Peace Corps workers to be operatives of the CIA, might well be dissuaded from Director Deutsch's testimony that it hasn't been done during his 14 months, and from the collateral information that it is very, very rare occurrence, if ever, and for the very strong statements made about an American point of view against it. And certainly this is a matter which has been in the public domain with some emphasis since the report earlier this year by the Council on Foreign Relations on the future of U.S. intelligence, and the passage of the U.S. House of Representatives of legislation on the subject, 417-6, and a matter which is squarely before the Senate, and a matter within the purview of the Intelligence Committee to take a look at what the CIA is doing, to make an evaluation of it and consider whether there ought to be legislation on the subject. So, this is not a matter that we have made any unique disclosures on today. To the extent that others may be looking, if they thought every churchgoer or journalist or Peace Corps operative was a CIA secret agent, they would get a very, very different view from what we have heard here today. But we commend you on what you are doing worldwide, the Mary Null missioners, and with the religious organizations, and we will do our best to protect our interests and our activities. You made reference to the letter from Senator Hatfield and his letter from February 28, 1996, strongly opposing the use of churchgoers, will be made a part of the record. I'm going to go ahead and read it real quick. U.S. Senate, Washington, D.C., February 28, 1996. Honorable John Deutsch, Director, Central Intelligence Agency, Washington, D.C. Dear Mr. Director, it is with great disappointment and concern that I note recent reports regarding the possible relaxation of Central Intelligence Agency's regulation prohibiting the use of American clergy or missionaries abroad. It is my firm belief that this practice tarnishes the image of the United States, prostitutes the church, and violates the First Amendment's separation of church and state. Your pronouncements that the regulation is subject to waiver, as well as a recent panel's recommendation to loosen the regulations, are very disturbing to hear. As you know, the internal regulation prohibiting the use of clergy and missionaries abroad was issued in 1976, following a personal exchange between myself and then Director George Bush. In return for Director Bush's assurance, I withdrew legislation which would have created a statutory prohibition against federal intelligence agency involvement with members of the clergy and missionaries. I do not recall it being conveyed to me at any time that the new regulation could later be waived at the discretion of a particular director or deputy director. When we allow the CIA or any other government intelligence agency to use our missionaries to perform political intelligence operations, we prevent the church's mission and bring discredit upon the foreign policies and credibility of the United States. Moreover, the suspicion created by CIA involvement with even one overseas member of U.S.-based religious organizations puts the welfare of all missionaries in jeopardy. Therefore, allowing a waiver of this policy is tantamount to declaring no policy at all. While I appreciate your attempt to clarify that these activities would be initiated and approved only in extraordinary situations, I again have to reiterate my strong opposition to this practice under any circumstances. It is my hope that you will reaffirm the CIA's regulation prohibiting these activities and clarify that waivers will not be given in the case of members of clergy or missionaries. Thank you for your personal attention to this matter. Sincerely, Mark O. Hatfield, U.S. Senator. Chairman Specter. So, we thank you, and that concludes the hearing. Sister Claudette, thank you. Dr. Orm, thank you. Dr. Page, thank you. Dr. Argue, thank you. Thereupon, at 12:15 p.m., the hearing was concluded.
No, you're pretty smart. Uh-oh. That did it. Now, don't get careless, at least any more than you have already. Say, I got a hunch that's a one-way street. Yep, I was right. Now what do you do? Easy. That's it. Back out now. Oh, wait a minute. Those aren't for eating. Nobody does that. Easy now. Oh. Now look, pal. Take it easy. Oh. Well, you've wrecked the joint now.